First, I wish to thank the Candidates Association from the bottom of my heart for this great honor. No professional or academic achievement could ever mean more to me than being designated a master teacher by you. I'm also very grateful for the opportunity to address you today to share with you my views about and approaches to teaching psychoanalytic concepts from multidisciplinary perspectives. Let me begin by directing your attention to Sigmund Freud's essay, The Question of Lay Analysis, written in 1926, to justify his view that specialized training in psychoanalysis should be considered a necessary qualification for practicing it, rather than a medical degree or any other degree per se. In this essay, Freud provides us with invaluable, and I would argue indispensable, advice for students and teachers of psychoanalysis. If today we had to found a college of psychoanalysis alongside of depth psychology and the symptomatology of psychiatry, analytic instruction would include branches of knowledge which are remote from medicine: the history of civilization, mythology, the psychology of religion, and literature. Unless he or she is well at home in these subjects, an analyst can make nothing of a large amount of his material. Why myths and literature? One reason, in my opinion, is that myths are a product of and are perpetuated by storytelling, a privileged and treasured source of experiential instruction and learning. In his book about fairy tales, Once Upon a Midlife, Dr. Alan B. Chinen made the following claim: the reason for the ageless appeal of fairy tales can be summed up in the old Hasidic proverb, "Give people a fact or an idea and you enlighten their minds. Tell them a story and you touch their souls." Following the lead of many others, I would propose adding cinema, another way of telling stories and touching souls, to Freud's list. In 1997, Glenn Gabbard expressed eloquently and forcefully just this conviction. In this issue of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, we inaugurate something that will become a regular feature: film reviews. Our reviewers will be asked to bring a psychoanalytic perspective to the understanding of a particular film. In other words, how does a psychoanalytic reading of a film uniquely illuminate its meaning? The editorial decision to include film reviews in this journal represents an acknowledgement that cinematic art now takes its place alongside dreams, literature, and art as a cultural achievement that deserves serious study. Films have become a storehouse of the psychological images of our time. They serve many of the same functions for contemporary audiences as tragedy used to serve for 5th century Greeks. Not only do they provide catharsis, they also unite audiences with their culture through the mythical dimensions in the same way that Aeschylus and Sophocles provided vision for the citizens of Athens. Both films and psychoanalysis have human motivation as a prime focus of their respective pursuits. Psychoanalytically based ideas about human motivation have become so commonplace in the cinema, they are now a regular feature even in mainstream Hollywood films. To conclude, he wrote, audiences do not attend films merely to be entertained. They queue up at the local multiplex to encounter long forgotten but still powerful anxieties that stem from universal developmental experiences. By confronting them at a distance in a darkened cinema, they have the opportunities to master those anxieties vicariously and leave enriched and relieved. As with all forms of art, when we study film, we study ourselves. Today I have chosen to discuss the movie Ordinary People to illustrate and exemplify this point. This film is especially valuable as a vehicle for exploring the phenomenology and psychodynamics of narcissism and of the related failure to mourn. In the 1970s, Dr. Kernberg and Dr. Kohut put narcissistic personality disorder on the psychoanalytic and psychiatric map. In 1979, Christopher Lasch published his scathing critique of the Me generation, The Culture of Narcissism. A phenomenal bestseller, in 1980 it won the National Book Award in the category of Greatest Current Interest. Also in 1980, as if right on cue, along came the movie Ordinary People, directed by Robert Redford and starring Timothy Hutton, Mary Tyler Moore, and Donald Sutherland. It won Academy Awards for Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Supporting Actor for Timothy Hutton, playing the role of Conrad Jarrett, the teenage protagonist of our drama. For our purposes, Conrad's story can best be summarized and examined from the vantage point of theories of myth espoused by Joseph Campbell. Campbell proposed the notion of an overarching monomyth that stories follow the trajectory of there was order in the world, and order is destroyed, and order is restored by a hero or heroine. In the journey with the hero with a thousand faces, Campbell identifies a quest pattern as typifying the journey of the hero in fairy tales, myths, and legends. His paradigm, a blueprint for the journey, following Carl Jung, identifies a pattern of separation from ordinary life, a call to adventure, a threshold crossing, an initiation, for example, a confrontation with an antagonist, and the return crossing and reincorporation into the community. The threshold crossing involves a crossing into another realm, a realm of magic and fantasy. Campbell's model illuminates the relationship of the fantastic and the everyday. They are perceived as coexisting in tangential worlds that the protagonist experiences and must reconcile. The protagonist undertakes a journey into this magical realm. According to Campbell, the transition into the realm represents in part his or her exploration of his own unconscious mind. On this journey, the hero encounters allies and enemies. He crosses over into the realm, the magical realm, the psychoanalyst consulting room, to acquire what he needs, the elixir, to confront his adversaries and achieve his goals. In the process, he traverses age-appropriate developmental milestones and is initiated into membership, for example, into adulthood. Along the way, the hero finds crucial assistance from a mentor, like Gandalf or Frodo in Lord of the Rings, an archetype of the wise old man, and frequently a young woman who greatly facilitates the completion of the journey. Order in Conrad's and his family's world was destroyed by his brother's drowning in a sailing accident that Conrad survived. In the wake of that tragedy, Conrad, presumably because of unbearable grief and guilt, made a very serious suicide attempt which resulted in a 4-month psychiatric hospitalization. Like many protagonists of myth, fairy tales, and legends, he narrowly escaped death and was symbolically resurrected like Snow White and Sleeping Beauty. He began his psychotherapy in the hospital, thus initiating his journey into the magical realm. He then crossed back to the ordinary world, where he had been for 1 month at the beginning of the film. At that point, he had not progressed sufficiently to repair his ordinary world. He still was trying to pretend that he was okay and trying to act as if he could, by force of will, act the same as he was the year before. But persistent nightmares and encouragement from his father, a key ally, compelled him to answer the call to resume his psychotherapy with Dr. Berger. At first, his treatment goals were to be in more control and to not worry anyone. Dr. Berger said that he himself was not big on control, but the control was a tough nut to crack and required 2 sessions a week. In between sessions, he would cross back over into the ordinary world where he encountered allies and enemies. At choir practice, he met Janine Pratt, who would prove to be a crucial ally. She praised him as being very energetic and her first choice to do the solo. To her, he was clearly attractive and appealing. His principal adversary would turn out to be his mother, who, unlike Janine, did not consider him to be her first choice, to say the least. It soon became apparent that she would rather not have him around at all. Another enemy he encountered was the swimming coach who, like his mother, carried a torch for his dead brother, who had been a championship swimmer, unlike Conrad. He and Conrad's mother devalued him, treating him with indifference or contempt. Through his work with Dr. Berger, his mentor, he became empowered enough to confront his adversaries and eventually vanquish them with the assistance and encouragement of his father and Janine. He quit the swim team and confronted his mother in a pet scene that we will see in our first clip. He encountered other obstacles and ordeals along the way. When he tried to resume his friendship with Karen, a fellow patient in the hospital, she was unavailable. After her discharge, she had shut down emotionally, resurrecting a Winnicottian false self, pretending all was well to please her family, and adopting manic defenses. She told Conrad that therapy had not worked for her, that she could only help herself, or at least that's what my father says. She told Conrad that she couldn't stay long. She had to rush off to go to a drama club meeting. We're doing a production of 1,000 Clowns for Christmas. It's going to be the best Christmas ever. On the way out of the restaurant, she startled the customers by shouting, "Cheer up!" Conrad then asked Janine out on a date. He started to tell her about his suicide attempt. He was interrupted by drunken revelers, fellow students who swept Janine out of her seat, plopped a Santa Claus hat on her head, disturbing and embarrassing her. More manic defenses. Giggling nervously, she rejoined Conrad, but the spell had been broken. Conrad retreated back into his shell, once again thwarted by the manic defenses. Be happy, don't worry. A second ordeal for Conrad was a fight with a rival for Janine who had challenged him. And his third chief ordeal was dealing with Karen's suicide, which triggered flashbacks of his brother's drowning. This additional tragedy compelled Conrad to deepen his psychotherapeutic journey with Dr. Berger, facing his pent-up feelings of guilt and anger at his brother and forgiving himself and his brother in the process. As a result of work with his mentor, he was empowered. The Force was with him, as Luke Skywalker had acquired the Force from Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. Along the way, he got his father to realize that his mother hated him. The father then assumed his own call, answered his own call to cross over into the magical realm of therapy, seeing Dr. Berger for his own treatment. His wife, he tried to invite his wife to meet with Dr. Berger, but she adamantly refused. I am me. This is my family. We can fix our own problems. I don't want any more changes. I don't want any surprises. I just want to hold on to what I've got. Calvin eventually, empowered by Dr. Berger, confronts his wife in a scene that we will witness in clip 3. And she departed from the family, and order was restored. As in fairy tales, there was a happy ending. The moral order of the universe was affirmed. Truth triumphed over falsehood, the family over the individual, love over hate, and life over death. In the process, Conrad had traversed age-appropriate adolescent milestones, achieving autonomy and independence from his parents, discovering and affirming his own values in the process. He had proven he could be attractive to a woman in spite of his mother's feelings about him. Now, after that overview, let's focus more on the personalities of our protagonists, examining in detail some key scenes in which their characters are manifested. First, Mrs. Jarrett. At the beginning of our story, Beth is a veritable ice queen, wielding absolute power over her domestic domain. She tyrannizes and oppresses her subjects, her son and husband. She dominates her husband with a combination of seduction and devaluation. Her son she either ignores or berates or bombards with imperious commands. She maintained her supreme self-confidence, steely demeanor, and resolve by relying on an extensive array of primitive defense mechanisms, including massive denial, omnipotent control, splitting, idealization, devaluation, and projective identification. She still carries the torch for her idealized, dead, fair-haired son, Buck, her favorite, with whom she has identified. Her grandiose self is comprised of her own self-image, her ideal self, and her introjected, idealized image of Buck. Everything bad has been projected onto her bad, dark-haired son, Conrad, or onto her husband when he fails or disappoints her. She is oblivious to the emotional realities of life in her family, wanting things to appear normal, pretending everything is okay, denying her surviving son's evident and persistent difficulties, reintegrating into life at home and at school following his discharge from the hospital. Returning home late from the theater one night, she proceeds upstairs, ignoring the light on in her son's room, and proceeds directly into the master bedroom. Even though he has recently been hospitalized following a serious suicide attempt, she does not knock on his door, ask how he's feeling, or tell him good night, let alone that she loves him. She appears indifferent or covertly hostile towards her son. By contrast, when her husband later comes upstairs, he knocks on Conrad's door and asks his son if he's having trouble sleeping. Conrad denies it and pretends to be up late reading. Calvin, his father, sees through his son's ruse but accepts his cover story. Burning the midnight oil, eh? However, Calvin does suggest that Conrad contact Dr. Berger, to whom he had been referred upon discharge from the hospital. His son, not yet ready to answer the call, insists that the deal was that he would call Dr. Berger if he needed to. The next morning, Beth does make Conrad his favorite French toast for breakfast. When Conrad says he's not hungry, Beth immediately scoops up his plate, dumps the French toast in the garbage disposal, and grinds it to smithereens, giving the distinct impression that she'd just as soon put Conrad in the garbage disposal as well. Her husband tries to stop her. "What are you doing? He'll eat it." She replies that French toast doesn't keep. She is furious with Conrad for rejecting her food. It's all about her. She's not interested in her son's loss of appetite. Conrad had deviated from her script. In a perfect world, good sons eat their favorite foods whenever mother makes it for them. She abruptly terminates the conversation by asserting that she has to depart immediately for a 9 a.m. match. Tennis or golf, I presume. First things first. Eventually, recurrent nightmares in which Conrad relives scenes from the sailing accident in which his brother had died, eventually drive him to reach out to Dr. Berger. He tells his parents only after his first session. His father is surprised, but evidently delighted. That's great. That's great. His mother is also shocked, but is visibly annoyed and evidently not pleased. "I didn't know you made an appointment." Something had transpired on her turf to which she had not been privy, representing for her a troubling and infuriating loss of control. She presciently is concerned that Dr. Berger represents a threat to her hegemony. She's not going to go down without a fight. Shortly thereafter, she tries to seduce and cajole her husband into taking the family on a 3-week trip to London for Christmas. Calvin objects because Conrad had just begun treatment with his doctor. He is concerned that if their work is interrupted, maybe his son won't resume therapy upon their return. This prospect does not deter Beth at all. If he changes his mind, maybe it's not right for him to do. When asked by her husband, why interrupt it, she brazenly declares, "Because I want to get away." Calvin, we've always gone away at Christmas time. Evidently, in Beth's world and worldview, everything should be back to normal. It's about her. Conrad be damned. Normal means keeping up appearances. Admitting that all is not well is not on the agenda of the ideal household. At a cocktail party, Beth overhears Calvin telling a friend that Conrad is in therapy. She interrupts the conversation to humiliate and embarrass her husband. "Is he falling asleep on you yet?" Later on, the ride home, she furiously berates him for drinking too much and betraying the family's privacy by airing their embarrassing and shameful secrets in public. A shameful lack of control, further evidence of his contemptible weakness. He sadly but tellingly attempts to defend himself by appealing to her narcissism. It's a status symbol, like going to Europe. Another particularly revealing scene took place in her dead son's room. Thinking she was home alone, she entered Buck's room and sat on the bed, lost in her own thoughts, as if in a reverie, surveying all of his pictures, trophies, and other belongings, which had been arranged and displayed as if in a museum. Conrad unexpectedly appeared in the doorway, startling her. She yelled, "Don't do that," treating him as if he were an unwanted intruder. He apologized and tried to make it up to her by telling her that he had done well at swimming practice. Maybe he can please her by trying to be more like Buck, her preferred son. Personally, I think I could swim the 50 if my timing gets better. When she noticed that he was leaning on a wardrobe, she interrupted him mid-sentence, yelling, "Off!" as if he were a dog who had sat down on a couch that was off limits. Forbidden territory. Conrad evidently had violated an injunction barring anyone from touching any objects in the museum. This dog motif will figure prominently in the first clip of the movie that we will view today.
It's cold out here. You should put that on, or do you want a sweater?
Do I need one?
What are you doing?
Nothing. Thinking.
About what?
Not about anything.
Your hair is starting to grow out. It's looking better.
I was thinking about the pigeon. You know, the one that used to hang around the garage? And how he used to get on top of your car and he'd take off when you pulled out of the driveway.
Oh, yeah, I remember. I remember how scared I used to get of that whoosh, flap, 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 every time I started the car.
Yeah, that was the closest we ever came to having a pet. You remember Buck asked you, he tried to talk you into getting a dog? Do you remember that? And he said, how about if it's just the size of a little football?
You know, that animal next door, that Pepper or Pippin, whatever his name is.
Pippin.
He's not a very friendly dog. I don't care what Mr. McGreary says.
What he really
He's
wanted
really
was the
not.
retriever that was down the street for
and
sale.
every time
That's
that
what he
dog
wanted,
comes
the
into this
retriever.
backyard and I try to get him out, Put that on if you're going to stay out here, okay?
At the beginning of this scene, Beth is at her most human and loving towards Conrad, uncharacteristically demonstrating affection and concern, showing some interest in him. "What are you thinking?" He said nothing. Then he decides to answer her question, recalling that a pigeon was the closest thing to a pet that they ever had. He wondered why she didn't allow Buck to have the golden retriever that was for sale down the street. She tries to sidestep his question, looking away and instead telling him how bad the neighbor's dog is and how she will not let it in the yard. For Beth, pets, and by implication life, is scary and messy. Conrad responds by interrupting her and trying to talk over her and defiantly barking at her, "Arf, arf!" At last, subversively, a pet had finally invaded the yard. At that point, she attempted to regain control. "If you're going to stay outside, put on that sweater." Okay, and clip 2.
Can I help?
Help what? Oh, you mean with this?
Yeah.
No.
I will.
No, I'll tell you what you can do, though. You can go upstairs to that room of yours and clean out the closet.
Mom?
Okay? Because it really is a mess. Hello? Oh, hi. Yeah, no, I didn't get there. I was swamped with work. How'd it go? No, I'm not doing anything. Just getting ready for dinner. Uh-huh. Did she really?
Well, anyway, Mary Ann Raven started to just scream, just cry, right?
It was crazy. We got so drunk that we couldn't talk to each other. It was the last day of school. We walked right out of the building. We had,
walked out?
It was in the middle of class.
Oh, lucky. No, stop.
Conrad followed his mother into the house, asking if he could help her set the dining room table. She spurns his offer. She doesn't need or want his help. Instead, she tells him to go upstairs and clean out his dirty, messy closet. With Dr. Berger's help, Conrad is eventually able to face his demons, in particular, that his mother hates him. He shares this insight with his father, endeavoring to break through the father's denial and failure to address his wife's behavior towards her son. When Conrad confronts his mother in front of his father with her failure to visit him even once during his hospitalization, his father tries to make excuses for her. She tried to visit you, but they wouldn't let her in. She had a cold. Apparently the longest one on record. Conrad fires back, if Bucky had been in the hospital, you would have visited him. She retorted, Bucky wouldn't have been in the hospital. Devastating Conrad, who rushes upstairs in tears. When his father proceeds upstairs to confront him, Beth refuses to join him, condemning her husband for being weak and indulgent towards Conrad. But with Dr. Berger's help and following his son's lead, Calvin eventually confronts his wife in the scene we will see in a moment. But more about this second scene. Beth laughing on the phone. Of course, she had put on her persona her social persona for the friends. She never smiled and laughed like that with her husband and son. It reminded Conrad of how much Buck could make her laugh, unlike Conrad. And in the flashback, in the memory, the scene was in the yard where Beth and Conrad had the talk about the pets. But in this scene, Beth was lying, rather suggestively, I would say, in short shorts on the grass at the feet of her favorite son, looking up at him adoringly and laughing at his risque exploits. He was telling her that he and his girlfriend had gotten drunk before school, the last day of school, and had made a scene in the classroom and then promptly left school. That's when she said, "Oh, Bucky." Clearly Bucky didn't have to be perfect. At least he could do no wrong. Now for clip 3, the end of the movie.
Why are you crying? Can I get you something? What did you say? Calvin, what did you say? Tell me.
You are beautiful. And you are unpredictable. But you're so cautious. You're determined, Beth. But you know something? You're not strong. And I don't know if you're really giving. Tell me something. Do you love me? Do you really love me?
I feel the way I've always felt about you.
It would have been all right if there hadn't been any mess. But you can't handle mess. You need everything neat and easy. I don't know. Maybe you can't love anybody. There's so much Buck. When Buck died, it was as if you buried all your love with him, and I don't understand that. I just don't know. Maybe it wasn't even Buck. Maybe it was just you. Maybe finally it was the best of you that you buried. But whatever it was, I don't know who you are. I don't know what we've been playing at. So I was crying. Because I don't know if I love you anymore. And I don't know what I'm going to do without that.
Dad?
The yard looks smaller without leaves.
Dad, what happened?
Your mother's going away for a while.
Where? Why?
Back to Houston. And I don't know.
Why? What? I know why. It's me, isn't it?
No.
Yeah, it is. It's my fault.
Don't do that. Don't do that to yourself. It's nobody's fault. Things happen in this world. People don't always have the answers for them, you know. I don't know what I'm yelling at you for.
No, that's right. You're right. You ought to do that more often.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Haul my ass a little, you know? Get after me. The way you used to for him.
Oh, he needed it. You didn't. You were always so hard on yourself. I never had the heart.
Oh, Dad, don't.
Oh, it's the truth. I never worried about you. I just wasn't listening.
Well, I wasn't putting out many signals then. I really don't think you could have done anything.
No. I should have got a handle on it somehow.
You know, I used to figure you had a handle for everything. You knew it all. And I know that wasn't fair, but you always made us feel like everything was going to be all right. I thought about that a lot lately. I really admire you for it.
Well, don't admire people too much. They'll disappoint you sometimes.
I'm not disappointed. I love you.
I love you too.
So let me, well, that scene sort of speaks for itself. She almost broke down, but apparently she, which would have given her a chance to regain her humanity, but she apparently steeled herself and went off without saying goodbye to her son. And you can see it's amazing how closely these plots follow the plots of fairy tales, the requirements of fairy tales, including that it turns out that the unfavored son was actually the stronger son, both physically in terms of surviving during the accident, and that he hadn't been the one his father needed to worry about. So the sympathetic protagonist turns out to be a prince after all, or at least worthy of marrying the princess, right? He turns out to be the prince. Let me again close with some comments about mourning and the failure to mourn, mourning and melancholia, and the manic defenses against mourning, and how the struggle between Eros and Thanatos, life and death, is played out over the issue of mourning. For Ogden says, I'm quoting Thomas Ogden, and then I'll quote from John Steiner, who both written on this subject. For Freud, melancholia is a disease of narcissism. A necessary precondition for melancholia is a disturbance in early narcissistic development. The melancholic evades the pain of loss through regression from narcissistic object relatedness to narcissistic identification. The melancholic's abandonment of the object after a death, for example, as opposed to the mourner's loss of the object, involves a paradoxical psychological event. The abandoned object for the melancholic is preserved in the form of an identification with it. The painful experience of loss is short-circuited by the melancholic's identification with the lost object, thus denying the separateness of the object. The object is in me, and I am the object. There is no loss. An external object is omnipotently replaced by an internal one, the ego identified with the object. Although Freud did not speak in these terms, it could be said that the internal-object relationship is created for evading the painful feeling of object loss. This avoidance is achieved by means of an unconscious deal with the devil. In exchange for the evasion of loss, the melancholic is doomed to experience the sense of lifelessness that comes as a consequence of disconnecting oneself from large portions of external reality. In this sense, the melancholic forfeits a substantial part of his own life, the three-dimensional emotional life lived in the world of real external objects. The internal world of the melancholic is powerfully shaped by the wish to hold captive the object in the form of an imaginary substitute for it. Again, the ego identified with the object. The individual replaces what might have been a three-dimensional relatedness to the mortal and at times disappointing external object with a two-dimensional shadow-like relationship to an internal object that exists in the psychological domain outside time and consequently sheltered from the reality of death. In so doing, the melancholic evades the pain of loss, but does so at the loss of a good deal of his or her own emotional vitality. The conflict between, this is John Steiner, the conflict between mourning and melancholia becomes acute whenever the status quo is disrupted, often when a development faces the patient with a new capacity to appraise reality so that the conflict over loss can begin to be faced, worked through, and understood. These experiences involve giving up omnipotence and facing loss. In bereavement, the central issue is whether the reality of loss can be faced with the attendant feelings of regret, remorse, and guilt. If reality cannot be faced, then defensive processes are mobilized which deny the loss. The defensive processes involve a variety of mechanisms, including manic triumphs, obsessional control, and sadomasochistic humiliation of his objects, all of which were evident in ordinary people. The melancholic solution offers a compromise in which the object no longer exists in the external world, but is possessed and controlled in the internal. After bereavement, the life instinct slowly seems to recover and to help the patient let go of his attachment to the dead object and re-engage with life. The death instinct is more difficult to formulate, but it can be thought of as an anti-life force expressed as the conservative tendency to hold on to the dead object. So let me, again, it's amazing how artists of all sorts, writers, filmmakers, can depict these issues so poignantly and tellingly in a way that brings them to life. For example, the pet scene, which is incredible that that's what he chooses to confront his mother's anti-life force. You know, the fact that the house was a museum, if not indeed a mausoleum. Right? Now that reminded me of a quote I read years ago from The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis, with which I'll end, that was just about this subject. There is no safe investment. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safely in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, and irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. Thank you.